Hello linguists, welcome to episode 8C, in which we learn how to spot the French loanword. We've been talking a lot about how the impact of the Norman French in 1066 turned the Germanic Old English language into a hybrid Germanic/Latinate or Italic Middle English. And we talked about all the words, thousands and tens of thousands of them, that entered the Germanic language of Beowulf and Cadman from the Norman French. Well, all of that rot is not a lot of use to you unless you have some methods for spotting the French loan words which showed up in English as a result of that meteor crash. They should become as obvious to you as the President of France among those British beefeaters. Which is to say, today's lesson will be all about Où est Charlie, which is the French version of Where's Waldo? But first, a couple tidbits. I wish I knew who'd given this to me, but it showed up. It's one of those little advertising magnets. It showed up on my metal door one day, and I couldn't have been more pleased. Someone knew exactly what kind of gift I want. So this is from Nebraska. Notice that the state of Nebraska is outlined. And it's from the University of Nebraska Health Promotion Committee. And I can just imagine the committee there at the U of N getting together and think, how can we come up with a nice magnetic sort of sticker to make people more healthy? Because that's our job, to promote health. And they think, what tools do we have available to us? I know, says someone, etymology. I laugh, but I actually love this. So, with the motto, getting the whole job done requires good health, they give us the following. Health, or health, which is a noun, period. Middle English, comma, boy, this is terribly laid out. Health, from Old English, health, which meant wholeness. And if you can follow all of the less than or equal than signs, it's from the word hal in Old English, which means whole. There's actually a very good point there, though it could almost not have been written any less clearly, that yes, the word health does come from the word whole. So to be healthy is to be whole. I'm just wondering how many people have actually become more healthy or more whole because of that etymology. Who says that etymology is no good for anything in the world when we've got this? All right, moving on. The New Yorker is probably the most erudite publication in America. That means educated. And their cartoons are notoriously difficult to decipher. These are not slap your knee, cut funny kind of cartoons. These are, interesting wisdom cartoons. So this, I submit, is the history of not only the English language, but really the history of power relations and how they determine what language gets spoken, what version of what language gets spoken where, throughout the world, throughout history. A single cartoon, the class, hell, in a single cartoon. You've got a duck, a pig, a fish, a cat, and another kind of bird. And they've all said woof, and they're all looking at the dog who's in an armchair. That means the dog is chairing the meeting. And the dog is not saying woof, he's saying, everybody gets a raise. So I'll ask you to think about what you've learned about power and pidgin and Creole and prestige dialect and invasions from both Power of Babel and the History of the English Language lectures. And they'll be part of the homework asking you the best question possible about humor, which is to explain it, to explain what this cartoon means. But now on to the main event. I'd like to introduce today's subject by pointing out something you might have noticed. That in English, unlike any other language I'm familiar with, our words for a particular food are not the same words for the animal that food comes from. For instance, why don't we go to Mickey D's and order a hamburger with a quarter-pound patty of cow? Why not? Why don't we pick up a bucket of Kentucky Fried Bird or Kentucky Fried Hen at KFB or KFH? Yuck, not nearly as appetizing, right? Why don't we drive down to Louisiana for a plate of pulled pig or pulled swine? Why don't fancy restaurants serve, a cutlet of deer is on the menu? You want to come over to my place tonight? I'm making calf parmesan. Doesn't that sound tasty? In these examples, I've used the animal word where I should have used the food word, but why are they different? The answer? 1066. The silliness I've just pointed out, the goofiness, is historical, of course, and it's represented in this nice image I found. You have a tuna fish sandwich. How about a ham pig sandwich or a chicken bird sandwich? Or a roast beef cow sandwich? I think I'll have the chicken bird myself. Place your orders. This chart, which we'll spend a few minutes on, explains the difference. Remember what we learned from the Chronicle of Robert of Gloucester. Handsome devil. Following 1066, following the Norman invasion, you had a basically Anglo-Saxon peasantry. So in the fields, in the hovels, in the pews of the church, in the underclass of society, the lower men, were speaking a Germanic language, Anglo-Saxon. That language would eventually be more, I wouldn't say adulterated, just admixed with French words, but they were speaking Old English, a Germanic language. Whereas the higher men, to use Robert's term, in the palace, the manor houses, the archbishop's seat, all of the nobility would have been speaking a different language, Norman French, which comes from Latin. Not Old English, which comes from German. So think about it. In the Middle Ages, you weren't able to go to, a restaurant like you can in America and get, 3.5 pounds of meat dumped on your plate for, $21. Meat was relatively rare in the peasant diet, and that's largely because of the forests being owned, so to speak, by the French nobility. There were laws that peasants were not allowed to hunt stags. That's a noble activity. And so you have a situation where the peasants tend or herd the animals, and the French nobility eat them. And from this situation, it's encoded and embedded in our language in the fact that we don't have a quarter-pound patty of cow because that's the animal word. And cow is a Germanic word. You can tell because it has a cognate in modern German, Kuh. Instead, we have a quarter-pound patty of beef, which is a cognate in modern French, bœuf. So, animal word, Germanic Old English. Food, cuisine word, cuisine is a French word by itself. The cuisine word, French, with a cognate in modern French. Similarly, calf, Kalb, auf Deutsch, is veal, or veau, in French. Swine is Schwein. That's also something that in the past Germans have called people that they wanted to deride or lower. Whereas pork, basically the same word in French, is the Latinate or food word. Sheep is Schaf in German, and the food word for sheep, it's served much more in England than it is here, is mutton. You can almost hear the Frenchiness of that word, mouton. Oui? Hen, also bird, are Germanic words, and we don't eat hens. We eat poultry. En français, poulet. Deer. The Old English deer didn't actually mean what we think of as a deer. The Old English word had a different meaning. It meant animal in general. But in any case, we don't eat deer. When we eat deer, we are polite enough to call it venison, venison. Again, a French word. So why we have this duality in our language? It's a historical record, a record of conquering, where the poor tended animals and the rich ate them as food. So how are you going to go about spotting the French loanword? That is, distinguishing in the language I'm speaking right now which words go back to Old English and are Germanic, and which words that I'm speaking right now are Latinate. Remember that French is an italic or Romance language, meaning it goes back to Latin. Which words am I saying went back to the Norman invasion, came over in those French boats, or were borrowed from the French in the period of Middle English, roughly 11th to 15th century? I'm going to give you 5 methods. Method 1 is spelling. The letter combinations you see on this page are pretty good, not 100%, but pretty good tip-offs that the word with that spelling combination came from French. That is, further back, from Latin, after 1066. So we have some diphthongs, EI, EY, OI, and OY. Not all the time, but most of the time, words with these combinations, hey, you can say, aha, I spot a French loanword. You came over after 1066. You would not ever show up in Beowulf or Cadman. You might, however, show up in Chaucer, and I can tell that you're probably from French. So take EI, rain, R-E-I-G-N, came over from France in the 13th century. The Middle English, the French, I remember, pouring in, and the words are pouring in. So anywhere from 11th to 15th century. Rain is 13th century. EY, take obey. Ooh, another power word. Also 13th century. Boil. Hey, a cuisine word. That kind of connects to the food and animal thing, right? Boil. It's 12th or 13th century, I think. The word coy, as in to his coy mistress. I think that's a little later, 14th century. And there's some endings, which let you know for certain that the word is originally Latin and probably came over along with the French following 1066. These, however, are a little bit less certain because English has borrowed from Latin many times and throughout its history, from the very beginning of Old English all the way up to the 18th century and today. I'm actually not going to make a big fuss about that, because my goal for this unit lecture is for you to be able to separate words that are Germanic in origin from Latinate in origin. And if some words sneak in which are Latinate, and you tell me, oh, it looks like that's a French word that came over as part of the Norman invasion, etc., and in fact it came directly from Latin, or maybe from French at another period of time, that's a detail which we would be concerned with in an advanced class. But if you can identify that as Latinate and therefore likely French, I'll be totally psyched. That's what your little inset paragraph says. So Tion, how about nation? That's 14th century from French. ENCE or ANC, these are endings. So temperance, sovereigns, also words from French. UR or URE, US or OUS, and MENT. So just take a minute, pause the lecture. There's part of the homework that asks you to do this, and brainstorm some examples of words with those endings or those diphthongs in them. You can, if you want, look them up in the OED or the online etymological dictionary and see if in fact they are Middle English French words or if they came from Latin somewhere else in our history. But either way, I'm perfectly fine with them as an example. On to method 2. Method 2 involves register. Register is a new linguistic term we've not talked about yet. Language has different registers. You can think of register almost like the style of language, including the vocabulary you pick, and different social contexts, or levels of formality you use for different purposes. You talk to your buddies at the cafeteria in a different register of language than you would talk to your grandmother, perhaps, or the President of the United States if she showed up or he showed up. And the idea, according to Robert of Gloucester, is Germanic words are low and French words are high. So take the blue square. We can say things in two different ways, often three different ways. We have near synonyms. We can ask or inquire. Which one's more formal? Which one has higher register? Inquire, right? That's Latinate. Ask, axion, that's Germanic. We can start, Germanic, or commence, that's Latinate, French. We can do, Germanic, or execute, that's Latinate. We can eat, Germanic, or what the French were doing with their venison and mouton, consume, higher register. In other words, Germanic words tend to be basic or common words. Look at the things around you you can name. Hand, foot, sun, sky, earth, book. These kind of basic first words you learn as a child. The elemental, I call them elemental, the concrete things around you, likely Germanic. Many of them are monosyllabic. Some of the first words you learned as a child. Mother, father. Latinate words, including our French loan words from Middle English, tend to be more abstract, more educated, like cognizant. I bet you learned that word later than you learned aware. They tend to have a kind of institutional feel about them, a cultured feel. They can be scientific. They're often polysyllabic. Notice how the words on the left in our blue square are longer than the words on the right. And these, to be just general about it, in terms of your own educational history, probably words you learned for the ACT or SAT or in a vocabulary class as you got older, as opposed to the elemental words going back to Germanic. And just, I want to pause to say that poets ever since, and writers ever since this split in register happened, have been taking advantage of it. Think what you can do stylistically by characterizing someone's language as Germanic. Well, it portrays them as maybe less educated, less cultured, less old, versus Latinate, someone who is educated, erudite, pompous. Chaucer does this, Shakespeare does this, and so by being able to distinguish Germanic from Latinate / French, you're going to have attuned your ears to a whole new register of language that both poets and prose authors take great advantage of. And up through Shakespeare, at least very consciously, knowing what they were doing. On to method 3. Because the French took over the upper echelon of society and created a lot of the institutions of the government of the English for hundreds of years, a lot of institutional words tend to be French. So everything on this slide and the next slide came into Middle English through the Norman French. So church words, paradise, sacrament, clergy, friar, sermon, religion, ION word, law, attorney. You can almost hear, I bet, the French in that, can't you? Crime, defendant, evidence, government, parliament. You see some of our spelling rules playing out right here, don't you? Verdict. Military words, artillery, captain, corporal, marine, sergeant, volunteer. Cuisine words, food words, beef, boil and broil, 2 OI words, right? Some of the words we saw before, stew and veal. Culture words, claret, the wine, as well as clarinet, dance, diamond, fur, jewel, oboe, pendant, sculpture. And I want to focus on this last list, some words which have to do with power directly. Prince, dame, master, court, rent, rich, poor, crown, and purple. The language of power comes from the language in power. In fact, you can tell the story of 1066 using French power vocabulary. The masters of the island are now dames and a prince, not a lord and a lady. What do a dame and a prince do? They hold court. What does a court do? Charges rent. What does the charger of the rent become? Rich. What does the person charged rent become? Poor. Who ultimately gets all that rent? The crown. What does the crown wear? Purple. The language of power comes from the language in power. Woof! Method 4. As part of your homework, I'll ask you to go back through the 4 texts we've looked at. Cadman, Good Samaritan, Punning Pope, and Seafarer, and from each to come up with some words which tell you that they are not French. They couldn't be, right? This is pre-1066, Old English. But they are Germanic. How do you do that? Let's take Cadman. You can tell that a modern English word goes all the way back to Old English. It's good Anglo-Saxon stock and is not French. If you see it in Old English and you can recognize a modern word which is close to it in meaning and in form. So the very first word, nu, is now. That's what it means, and that's what it looks like and it sounds like. So it was already here. The second word I could have included in that list, but I didn't, shall. Heovon, so heaven. Wayard, I translated it guardian, but you see the word warden in it. So I would grab warden as the word which is modern English going back to Anglo-Saxon. Wayard changes a little bit, means one who guards, comes to us as warden. Meotode, I've given you measurer, but if you listen to the word itself, you hear method. I could have put and his on there, though they're very common. But yes, in fact, they're elemental words. They do go all the way back. Oh, I missed meachta. If I translated that as power, it wouldn't be the word power that goes back. It's the word might. Meachta, M-I-G-H-T, which is clearly Germanic. And in mode, yeah, thunk. Mode, mood, and thunk, think. Those are clearly words we had long before the French arrived. And if you look through the beginning of our other texts, in the Good Samaritan, som man ferd are some of the first words on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And he came on the shadan, the scathers. So not the word robber, but the word scathe is Germanic. And he bereavadon hinna, and they bereaved him, or stole from him, robbed him. Bereave is Old English. And then some satcherd came along, a priest. So the word sacred is Old English. And they left him, after they had beaten him, some quickna, some quick, meaning some alive. So the word quick, in the sense of alive, is Old English. In the Punning Pope, he sees some English cheap men. So cheap did mean to sell back then, but it comes to us as the word cheap with a different meaning. But the word itself goes back to the Anglo-Saxons. And he brochtan herowara, they brought their wares, and Gregory's going along the strat, which is street. In Seafarer, which you looked at for your unit project, the speaker says, I can tell a sothied, a true story. And soth is sooth, like soothsayer or forsooth. Say, about bitter days, you swink dagum. Dag, day, day goes back to Old English. About bitter breast care. So bitter, breast, and care all go back to Old English. So you can strike those off the list as possible French words. Method 5 is the simplest of all. I'm going to give you a short reading to do along with this lecture, which I will end shortly. And it is hardly even prose. It's almost just a list of words which are in fact Anglo-Norman loanwords in Middle English. A note on the homework. Part of today's assignment is to make two lists of modern English words. Modern English words, right? One list which are Germanic in origin. You can know for sure if they are found in one of our Old English texts. And another list which is Latinate. And here you can use our 5 methods, well, 4 of our 5 methods, that they were in fact borrowed from French following 1066. Likely, using the spelling, the register, the subject, and the list of ones that just are. They just are because they're in the reading. And I want you to keep in mind, as you pick your list, that you're actually doing step 1 of a 2-step assignment, where step 2 will come later. But I want you to have it in mind as you do this first step. The words you create, you list today will be a kind of word bank for a creative assignment that I'm going to give you. I'm going to ask you to write a dialogue, and that dialogue will be between a peasant who speaks in modern English. No, I'm not going to ask you to write a Middle English dialogue. You can't come up with that. But a peasant who speaks modern English, yet his language is characterized by using words that go back to Old English, Germanic language. And the other, that's Cadman. The other is Lord Mutton, or Lord Mouton, if you prefer, who also speaks modern English and is the lord of the area where Cadman works. Cadman, let's make Cadman a goat herd or a shepherd or something. And this is set in maybe the 1400s, 1300s in the Middle Ages, and they're going to have maybe an altercation between a peasant named Cadman and a lord named Mutton, and the peasant's going to speak in good old Anglo-Saxon words in modern English, and Lord Mutton is going to use all kinds of flowery, fancy, institutional, cuisine-related, power-related modern English words which go back to the French borrowings and which have Latinate register and etymology to them.